So I didn't used to have any slides for this, but what happened is I added a whole bunch of more material beyond what's in the book. And it occurred to me that probably a lot of you don't know Windows Server Administration. And Windows Server Administration is actually super important. So now that I got students doing the pen testing championship or pen testing contest next week and getting the OSCP certification, I really need to add it in. So I added a whole bunch more projects. They're all extra credit for this class, but if you really want to know how to do pen tests, you got to do them because Windows domains are what everybody uses, and you need to understand the basic facts about them. So here, there's 6 projects is what I'm going to talk about. This is what's in the chapter of your book, is Nessus, Nmap scripts, Metasploit Scanner modules, and Nicto, and those are important tools to know about. And then I wrote 4 more projects where you make a Windows domain, and then you exploit a Windows domain, and learn how to pivot through it. And so those are essential techniques for pen testers, and they were not in my previous projects, so it's good to get there. So Nessus is just a vuln scanner. It's the most popular one in the world. It runs all these different scans, and in the project, let me bring up the project and point to the stuff from your textbook. The project is here. And there it is. This is 8. All right. So the stuff from your textbook is the basic things you can do here. You install Nessus. You run it. This is the way most open source Linux stuff works. They can't be bothered to make a GUI, so they just make a web server. So it serves up, see I'm on page HTTPS Kali 8834, and then you view it in a browser. So you log in, and then you have a page where you can make scans. And so you make a new scan. There's a thing called a basic network scan you can run. And if you run that, it doesn't take too long, and it gives you some general results about your security. So you see here, for vulnerabilities, that's what almost all vuln scanners do. It rates them by color, so red is bad and these other colors are less bad. And if you go down here, if you scan the Windows 7 machine, or excuse me, Windows Server 2008 that we're using here, it's of course got many critical vulnerabilities. That's the whole point of it. It's got about a dozen vulnerable software packages running on it, and the scanner finds some of them. So scanners are useful. They're dangerous. You can't trust them too much. They will miss things, and they will report things that aren't there. So they're part of a good pen test, but you have to go manually verify anything the scanner tells you. And you have to realize there could easily be things that it did not detect. So then another thing that's quite useful for scanners is a credential patch audit. And there's a Microsoft tool called Microsoft Baseline Security Analyzer, which can do this too. This will check to see if the Windows patches are installed. I know there was, Microsoft got a patent for a honeypot, and there were people talking about deploying honeypots and stuff on networks, and one of the big guys in security, I forget which one, posted, he said, you know, this is all nonsense. If you would just forget all the complicated stuff and actually update all the software, you do a lot more good than any fancy complicated things, because almost nobody really puts on all the updates. And that's what got Equifax do updates? Yeah, it was. Equifax was a patch vuln. They usually are. It's very hard to patch things. So this is something to know, is have you really put on the patches. And it also points out something that is an important thing about Nessus. You should give it the administrator password. If you don't give it the administrator password, it will scan a server, but it will not be able to find very much. If you give it the administrator password, it will log in, so will the Microsoft Baseline Security Analyzer, and then it can really do tests on the server to see what's on there. So putting credentials in on the Credentials tab makes your scan much more powerful. Of course, if you're doing, if you're doing a pen test, you may or may not have access to those credentials. But anyway, that's the game. That's what Nessus does. And it's a standard, and you should know how to run it. It's very easy to use. One good thing about vuln scanners is they will report the vulns. They will give you the identifier of the vuln, an MS number or a CVE number, and they will usually give you a whole page of explanation with links so you can research each of these vulns and decide what it means. Because this is just the first step. You run a scanner, it tells you have 10 vulnerabilities. Now you have to analyze them and decide, are they real and do they matter? Because it's very likely that a lot of them don't really matter in your environment. It's a service you're not using, there's some other mitigating factor like a firewall or something, and companies really shouldn't waste their time patching some esoteric problem that is not really going to hurt them. That's why you pay a human to make the value judgment of which ones of these are actually worth fixing and which ones are not. So what I wanted, anyway, when I was doing this earlier today to prepare for this, I noticed they had a drown scan. And drown is one of the, we'll talk more about it in the cryptography class, drown is one of the padding oracle attacks. There are two kinds of cryptography. There are stream ciphers and block ciphers. Stream ciphers encrypt every bit one by one with a long chain of bits, and block ciphers encrypt a block of bits, usually 16 bytes at a time. They both have weaknesses. The popular stream ciphers are not white. They do not have an equal probability of producing every byte. That's what's wrong with RC4. It has a slightly greater chance of resulting in a byte 127 than any other, and that means you can take billions of encrypted bytes and find patterns in them and deduce things about the key. And that has turned out to be such a huge problem that almost all versions of RC4 are now, almost all users of RC4 are now officially deprecated. So people go to block ciphers, but block ciphers have a problem because if the block size is 16 bytes and you try to encrypt 17 bytes, it has to fill in 15 of the bytes in the second block, and it will fill it in with something simple like all zeros, so you can very easily deduce something about the process because there's only 256 possible inputs. So you can just brute force them and deduce something about the key, and that's called a padding oracle. You carefully send it things that don't fit, so it puts in a certain number of bytes of padding, and then you can deduce something about the key by doing a mathematical analysis of that. And this is one of many of them. There was Beast, Crime, Lucky 7, and others. They all have these acronyms. Drown, however, is very special because Drown, so if you run the scan from Nessus on Drown, it will tell you low-strength ciphers, less than a 64-bit key. And you'll see that this thing has two 40-bit ciphers. Now 40 bits is terrible. And the reason it has 40 bits is because these are export-grade ciphers. You may not have been in the game long enough, but back in the 90s, the US government declared that cryptography was a US military secret. As if they don't have mathematicians in Japan and China and Russia and everywhere, Pakistan and Iran. They've got fine mathematicians over there, so our chance of preventing them from doing math is pretty small. But our government rated any computer that could do something like RSA 1024 as a military thing that can't be shipped out of the country. And so you may remember at the time you could not ship Microsoft Windows machines back in the days of like Windows 98 and Windows 2000. You couldn't ship Microsoft operating systems out of the country because they had high-grade encryption on them by the NSA standards. So Microsoft had to add export-grade cryptography options in their software, and so did anybody else that wanted to sell internationally. And then you would sell the international version that used really weak encryption. And therefore, all the server products had to support that, and they had to support it by default. So if you install the server, if you had clients, like our City College server, right? We're serving up the web page, we want to serve it over HTTPS. If we didn't allow you to use the weak encryption, nobody in China could see our web page anymore because they get the legal version of Microsoft Windows in China, and it can't use the modern encryption, so our server has to allow you to downgrade to weak encryption. So this creates the problem that servers are letting you downgrade to really miserable encryption, all the way down to SSL version 2 and the export grade that's only got a 40-bit key. And that is so short that you can actually brute force your way in. And so that's what these guys did. If you have the export grade ciphers, then he's able to do tens of thousands of sessions to collect data, and then 2 to the 50 encryptions on a server, which sounds like a lot, but it's not out of reach. I think they said it costs like $400 to break in once. If you use Amazon EC2 or a cluster of GPUs, it is possible. It's not something I can give you for homework. You can't do it easily in one virtual machine, but you can do it for about $400 worth of computing, and that's really pretty miserable. That means anybody that's motivated or rich can pretty easily get in your encryption. And we created this problem by outlawing strong encryption. And this is one of the many unintended consequences when you don't think about the globalization of the world. And the fact is, if you don't let encryption go everywhere, then you haven't really got it. This is like the current debate about whether we should give the cops a back door so they can get in all your encrypted stuff. If you do, sooner or later that back door is going to leak and then everybody can get in it. There's a fundamental issue here that doesn't get along with the concept of government people. Anyway, so that's Nessus found that vulnerability. Nmap can also find it. We've used Nmap as a port scanner where you just see what ports are open and maybe a banner grabber, but it also has script engines. You can use -S, and then it will run all of its scripts in the project. So it'll just try all the scripts it has, and the scripts will find things. So here it is enumerating SMTP. If you have an SMTP email server, it will try a whole bunch of methods and find out which ones work. So it finds out that you can send mail, you can, that looks like security option, SAML, and also you can Verify. Yeah, verify is allowed. Verify is considered a security vulnerability on an email server because you can check emails, use the verify command, and you don't actually send any mail, so no one's going to get anything and complain, so you can just brute force the email accounts now. Try thousands and thousands of verify commands. It's not considered wise to leave it turned on. But when I looked through this list, which I did again today, I also saw that it detected the vulnerability here. Here's the ciphers supported by SSL v2, and you can see RC2 128 CVC export 40 with MD5. That's a 40-bit scheme. And here's another one, export 40. So in the available ciphers that the HTTPS web server on that vulnerable machine is running, it does downgrade to the dangerous ones, and that $400 attack will in principle work against it. This is not Windows IIS. They've installed this thing called XAMPP, which is an open source web server, and they've of course installed an old vulnerable version. And it has this vulnerability along with many others. So I got a few cahoots about that, and then I want to talk about Windows domains. Oh, wait 5 more seconds and then go. All right. So, all right, which scanner is optimized for web applications? I forgot to mention it, but it's Nicto. Most people, not too many people knew it. Sorry, that's in the project and I forgot to mention it. However, such is life. That's part of why these things are extra credit, because there are errors. Anyway, which scanner can perform the credentialed patch audit? All right, that's Nessus, good. All right, that'll do. All right, so what's the web server that runs on Windows? XAMPP. I have no idea what it stands for, but anyway. All right, which one is an exploit caused by the US government limiting access to encryption? All right, that's Drown. Drown would not be a version of it that works even on stronger encryption, but the most dangerous version is because of that ridiculous, deliberately weak encryption. And which one is a secret attack developed by the US government? All right, that's Eternal Romance. We talked about it last time. All right, so let me report the winners. Stan, Serial, Color, and Day. So if you Nmap scripts, there's a whole lot of them, and you get these results that do a lot of tests. And there's also Metasploit Scanner modules you can use. If you just search for scanner, you'll see them. There's a lot of them. And you can choose various ones. Here I'm using the SMT enumerate scan, and we're going to use more of these enumerate ones later. This is one that enumerates the SMTP server, so you see the users, administrator, daemon, and so on. There's a lot of them. And here's another thing that they mentioned in the book about Metasploit. In case you didn't know, you do not have to attack people in Metasploit. You can use the exploit, set it up, and then sometimes you can check instead of attack. And it will just do the test to see if it's vulnerable. Not every module has this option, and of course it doesn't always work, but it is nice to know you can do that if you don't actually want to exploit the target. And Nicto, which I think we talked about in the last class too, is 123. Nicto is designed just for web servers, so if you have something like a XAMPP server, you can just run Nicto -H for this host. And the good thing about Nicto is it runs pretty fast. It only takes about 5 minutes. A thorough scan with a major vuln scanner takes hours. It finds a short list of fairly common problems. So this one here finds that the phpMyAdmin is incorrectly configured and exposing a lot of things that should be private, which is one of the many things wrong with that server. And if you look in the book, they hack in through phpMyAdmin. You can just guess the password and get into the management control system. It's not too complicated, but it is a vulnerability you'd see out there, especially on things like WordPress. But anyway, now I want to move forward to Windows, which is not in your book, but it's actually very important to know. So, let's talk about domain controllers. If you install Windows, it's got to be in one of two modes, in your networking mode. For home users, and for Microsoft says for less than 10 computers on your network, you use workgroup mode. Workgroup mode is what typical laptops are. It's not attached to a company. You have complete control of the box, and you can use it, and it just networks to machines near it, so you can do things like share a printer. That's what most people want with small networks. But at companies, they all want domains. And this is why Microsoft persists, because they wiped out Novell, who was the original people who had this stuff. If you have a company and you have 50 or 100 machines, especially if you have multiple locations, pretty soon, and you don't have a domain, pretty soon you have a horrible mess, because you add new employees and you go make an account on a machine, but you forget to make accounts on all the machines. You update software, but you don't really get it updated on every machine. And worse, people leave and you don't really remove their account from every machine, because you have to do things one by one. So if you don't have a domain and you run any kind of business, within a year, you've got a total mess, where you don't have all the files you need everywhere, you don't have the accounts right everywhere, you don't have the versions everywhere. So that's what domains are. A domain controller, you have to buy a server, which is why most people don't want to do it for home networks. You have to buy a box that does nothing directly useful. Nobody is actually surfing the web or typing Word documents on this box. It's just a domain controller, but that's where you have the central point of administration. All the password hashes are on the domain controller. All the permissions are assigned to the domain controller. All the file and printer shares are controlled by the domain controller. So you just make a decision. These people can print on the color printer. Those people can't. This person has been fired, or they're on vacation, so I turn off their account, and now they can't log in anywhere. And as soon as you make a new account, that person can log in everywhere. Or you can put them in a group and say they can only log in the sales department, but not the purchasing department, or something like that. You can control everything from a single point, and then you know what's going on. So it's essential, and every large company is using domains. So you got to know how to use them. So making a domain controller, in Windows Server 2012, it's very easy. In older versions, it was a little more command liney. Now it's all in the GUI. You have Server Manager. You just install a role. You install the Active Directory Domain Services role just by clicking and turning it on. Then it asks you some questions that are important. This one here asks, do you want to make a new forest? The question here is this the first domain controller at your company, starting the whole thing, or are you joining an existing company? And you could be joining the existing company in different ways. So you need to understand Microsoft's concept of a forest. So if I have a company named Contoso.com, you've got many machines here. Machines and people and domain controllers and servers and printers and everything are in this, and that's one company. If you have one location, that's fine, but then you might have a branch office. branch.corp.contoso.com, and so they'll have another domain controller down here, and that domain controller will handle logins here, and if these people want to log in with accounts up here, it will send signals up here and log them in, and the domain controllers will synchronize data, so if the person makes a new account here, it will propagate down there. A domain login is a very slow process and a very big process, and domain updates from domain controller to domain controller can take hours before they propagate, but that's the game. So this is a domain tree, they call it, and this is they call a forest, all the connected trees. And in a simple case, they all go to the same root, like Contoso.com and something.contoso.com, but in real companies, it's a total mess, because you do things like buy out another company and then plug them into your domain, and they continue to run with the old name. So it's actually much more complicated than this. And they call this whole mess of connected domains your forest. So when you define a new forest, you define the functional level, and this is real important for security. The default is always to use the newest version. If you make your forest functional level Windows Server 2012 R2, then it will be the most secure up to that date. But it also means you cannot have any older domain controllers in there. If you were trying to join a company and they're using Windows Server 2008 or Windows Server 2012 before the R2 domain controllers, they can't. So most people prefer legacy here to join existing structure, but if you do that, of course, you're not secure. You're no more secure than the old version because it's still speaking the old protocols. And every version has more complicated encryption, more security controls and all that. So the most secure option is always to make a native domain. But that would typically involve upgrading all your old stuff. And most companies are not willing to do that easily. What they're usually doing is they have an existing infrastructure and they're doing something like opening one more branch office. That's why you're putting up a new domain controller. So you can't specify the level, you have to match the level of the existing infrastructure. And this is, of course, how everybody gets hacked all the time. They have legacy stuff and it's too expensive to replace it all, so they keep using old stuff beyond its wise, useful life. So you make the accounts on a local machine, you make your accounts in users and groups in computer management, but on a domain controller, you use this Active Directory users and computers, and you make your accounts here. So you'll find a domain like hackme.com I made here, and then you have computers in there and other domain controllers and users. You can go make users in here, and this makes them on the domain controller, so that user can now log into any computer in the domain, unless you add a group policy to limit that. So that's making a domain controller. The next thing you need to do is put in a member server and learn how to configure some group policy. So your domain controller is the master. What people often do is have a client machine, but as I said, we don't have access to client software yet, so I just used another server as the member server, which is fine. When you log in to a computer, if you just put the name of the computer here, which is typically a long random name, and then backslash, and then a name like student, that's called the local login. That's the way you log in if you were not in a domain. Once you join a domain, you can choose to log in locally, and then you get access to the hard drive and the facilities on that computer, but not network resources. And if you log into the domain, then you get access to domain resources. So you do not lose the ability to log in locally when you join a domain. But in order to log in locally, you have to type the name of the computer backslash and then the username, which is kind of screwy at first. And so that's a local account. The password hash is stored on the C drive in the SAM file and the registry. And we've been cracking that in CNIT 123 and stuff. That's what you steal with tools like the Italian one, oxid.it Kane. Kane steals those hashes. You can crack them with John the Ripper and such. But you can also go to domain login. And then you put the name of the domain here, hackme/Sally. Now you're logging in with a domain account, and that hash is not on this machine. That's how you log in your domain login, and this hash is on the domain controller. So if you want to control the accounts, you do it with group policy. This is the reason you have domain controllers, so you can have complicated security settings as much as you want. So what I want to do is take the domain account Sally, and I want Sally to be a local administrator on the machine so Sally can work in the help desk. But she's not the domain administrator. The domain administrator can control the domain controller and add new users and Active Directory users and computers. And that's typically a person who's an expert on servers, but you have desktop support and they need administrative control over the individual endpoints, but not over the domain controller. So here's how you do it. You find the domain, you create a new group policy object in that domain, and then you put in some settings, and eventually you put Sally in the group administrators, which is now a restricted group, and this is a group. So the domain controller knows that Sally should be the local administrator over any machine she logs into. But what happens, remember I said, this won't have any effect for hours because it takes forever for the group policies to move through the network. And on Windows Server 2008, it was very flaky. That's why I went up to 2012 to make this work. You have this gp update/force command available. And that's what causes your machine to request an immediate update from the domain controller of what are the group policies. It calculates what applies to this machine and applies it. Now, since you've changed the account that I'm currently logged in as, it usually won't take effect until you log out and log back in to get your new privileges. But if you do log out and log back in, then Sally becomes a local administrator. Until she's logged in as hackme/Sally, a domain account, she can run things like administrator PowerShell. So now you've got a group policy, and you have a local administrator, and of course, now we want to practice exploiting this situation. Now we created a more or less reasonable situation with a domain controller and a member server and a domain account and a privileged domain account, and there's also the domain administrator account, and we want to wander around among these accounts. So we do exploit it somehow. Eternal Romance is my favorite attack. I think we should all learn it. I think this is the new MSO867. Every computer, every version of Windows is vulnerable. It doesn't crash the server. It's bloody awesome. So this should be a thing, just be your default attack for any Windows machine as far as I can tell. If they haven't patched since April, they're toast. And you get system privileges right away. You couldn't ask for more. You need, however, an SMB named pipe, but a bunch of them are on by default, and you can enumerate them with one of the modules in Metasploit. So there's the enumerate named pipe module to run, and when you run it, it will list all the named pipes. There's net login is often there, and there's a bunch of others that are often there. The one I found on my servers was called net login. So once you've found the name of a named pipe, you run Eternal Romance. You just get the exploit from exploit DB, you get the SMB software that is used to connect to the server message box share, and then you run it down here with just the name of it, Python and the name, and it will then run until you have to give it an IP and a pipe name to exploit. So, if you do give it an IP address and a pipe name, and one of the pipes I saw was net login, and I just tried one and it worked. So if you give it a right pipe name, it will run, and then it will tell you, creating file C pwned. Now this is not the original NSA exploit. That runs in a thing called FuzzBunch, which you can get from the shadow brokers, and that's like the NSA's version of Metasploit. But it's kind of painful to set up, and I didn't really care. I used a simple version that somebody derived from that and put in a Python script, and because it's a sort of script kiddie kind of hacking tool, it writes a file called cpwn.txt on the machine, which proves that you can write to the root of C. That means you're administrator. So it's a handy thing, and it's pretty harmless, but you can easily tell if it worked. So just go to your member server and you'll find that it's owned. So now that you can do that, if you just look at the source code, you can run any attack you want. So now I can run I'm going to create some malware. So use MSF Venom the way we've done it before, make an interpreter reverse shell to this command and control server. The only trick that it took me a while to figure out was you don't make an exe, you make an exe-service. Because the way the Eternal Romance exploit works is it executes whatever these commands as a service on the other end, not as a normal logged in user, and there's some differences in the environment there. So anyway, make it a shell service and put it in web directory var www.html, and then you can download it on the domain controller. Now if you wanted a social engineering attack, you'd now have to trick somebody or on a member server, on the server to go to a web page and download it, but this does not require any human interaction. Remember, I'm able to do the exploit and it will run a command line. I just have to choose a good command line to run. Now on Linux, you can use curl or wget to download files from the command line. And I didn't know it, but there's a Windows command that will download files from the command line. It is bitsadmin. It is really old. Microsoft has been trying to deprecate it for about 10 years, but it's still in modern versions of Windows. They keep warning you, we might take this out pretty soon. So this is how it works. Bitsadmin, transfer, web, priority, high, then you put in, it'll download that and put it in here, C, shellservice.exe. So you can run this bitsadmin thing, it'll download the file, then you can use double ampersands to put two commands on the same line, and it'll run it. So this will download that thing and run it locally, as if the local administrator was dumb enough to do that, and I don't have to have any human interaction, like MSO867. That's why it's just awesome. You just take over boxes, they don't even have to be logged in. If they're on, you're in, nobody has to make a mistake. Bloody awesome. So you run that thing, and you'll get an interpreter session open. Okay, and if you check your ID, your system. Because it's running as a service, it exploits all those services that are exposed to run in a system because they run before you log in. That's how it gets system privilege. So now that we're in, we can now try to exploit this box. This is the member server. So Incognito is one of the techniques to use here. If you use Incognito, you can steal tokens. So this is another bit of Windows administration that you should understand is what tokens are. If I look at the tokens that are available, there's one called Hack Me Sally, that's a domain token, and then there's local tokens like NT Authority System. That's the local system account which my shell, my Metasploit shell is running on this system account. And what tokens are, if you just open Task Manager on a Windows machine, you'll see processes and you'll see who owns them. So here's a process owned by system, Rundil32. This is something that launched by the system itself during the boot up usually. So it ran before anyone logged in, so it's running a system. Here's a network service account running. Here's Sally who's logged in running some things. And then there's the domain administrator has run a process on this box and left it running. That's of course the vulnerability we're going to exploit. And this is something people, according to the blogs I read, this is a fairly common thing. You find some process running on one of the machines as domain admin. And if you do, these tokens are not protected in any way. You can just copy them from memory and put them on another process and be that person. So anything, if you find a running process and you're the local administrator, you can imitate any of these people. And you do it with this Incognito attack. So here's, you have the impersonation tokens available. And so this is called pivoting. So this is the part that I think is the real point here. So here's the network the way I really have it set up so far. I've made a domain controller, I've made a member server, and I've got my Kali attacker, and they're all just on the same network. Now this is unrealistic. That is not how people do things. The way they really do things is they have a bastion host into their network, and it has 2 network cards, and they have a public network here, and then they have a private network, and people on the internet are not allowed to directly talk to high-value things like the domain controller. They can only talk to things like a web server, and then they have to take this over and pivot over there. So we could put in another virtual NIC and configure another network, but that's too much bother. I'm just sleazy and rotten. I just turned on a firewall to block this direction as a way to simulate this. So even though they're all in the same subnet, I'm going to turn on Windows Firewall on the domain controller to reject all data from the attacker. So the attacker cannot directly attack the domain controller, and you have to practice pivoting. You have to take over this box and then pivot from this box to that box. And that's what you have to do with real pen tests. So all you need is the Windows Firewall with advanced security. You add a new inbound rule, and you go through a little wizard, and there comes a point when you can block a whole series of IP addresses. So just choose a range that includes your Kali box, but not the member server, and that accomplishes a sufficient simulation of this kind of network. So now this is how you do it with AutoRoute. AutoRoute is a Metasploit post-exploitation module. So if you look at its info, it'll tell you what it does here, which is actually pretty nice. It manages session routing. This is actually a cute idea. You have an open interpreter session to some box. If you run sessions, you'll see it. You're going to route certain IP addresses through that session. So we'll go to that other box. So you run it, you just set the session you want to go to, you set the IP address you want to go to, you exploit it with add, and now it adds to what it calls a routing table. This is not a normal routing table. What they call it a routing table, anything in this address is going to go through that session, which means to the interpreter session there. And the result is, after you do that, if you just run any Metasploit attacks like a scanner, you'll see the box. It's running through that intermediate box. So that's the game here. So now that I've turned on pivoting, I can now send attacks to the domain controller that are actually passing through another server I own. Here's what I did on the member server. So while I was in a Sally shell, I read run as user/administrator. To run as the domain administrator, I opened a command shell as the domain administrator and left it open. This is why I have a domain admin token around. In a more realistic case, there'd be some kind of process logged in as the domain administrator that has to be there, or was forgotten, or crashed, or hung. But anyway, this is one way to create the situation where there is a token available to steal that has domain administrator privileges. So you use list tokens. It'll show you the delegation tokens available. Yeah, I have a domain user account called Sally, and I have the domain administrator account on that box, a token. And here, you can impersonate that token, get a delegation token, and now you can have a shell. And here I have a shell, and when I say who am I, I'm now HackMe administrator. So I'm now the domain administrator, and I have a command prompt, but I'm not running the command prompt on the domain controller. I'm running it on the member server. I've escalated my privileges, but I haven't got to the right box yet. So to get to the right box, you hunt through the exploits, and this is a pretty awesome exploit. Current user PS exec. Now you remember we've done this before. In the past, you had pass the hash attack. You can also run the hashes through John or something and crack them, but you don't have to. This will upload a file and run it. It'll execute a command on the server, and it'll do it with your current privileges with the token. You do not need to have a password or a password hash. It will simply do it as the currently authenticated user. And remember, I'm already authenticated as the domain controller administrator, even though I don't have the password or the hash. I piggybacked on a session that already had those privileges, or I copied the token to make my session. So I ran that thing, and once I do that, it gives me a session on the domain controller, and I can now run attacks. So I have a session number 5, which gives me control of the domain controller, and now I can run post Windows gather smart hash dump. Smart hash dump is a hash dump smarter than the one you'll find in Kane, because it'll dump both local hashes and domain hashes. And the domain hashes are stored in a completely different place. And there's a whole page on the Rapid7 website explaining how it does all sorts of tricky things. It finds the backups, it decrypts them, it hunts around, it tries to make sure to find them in a way that won't crash the box. They've put a lot of work into Smart Hash Dump, but it totally works. You run it, it tells you this host is a domain controller, and then you get hashes. You get Sally and Susan and the domain administrator, and then you get some local accounts. They're all here, and they all have the same kind of hashes. And now you got hashes, you could crack them to get passwords if they're crackable, and if not, you could just pass them to authenticate to Windows sessions like SMB, because Microsoft has never learned what a salt is in all these years. It's very curious, but in the Linux world quit doing this in 1975. Microsoft did not get the memo yet. That's handy for us. Anyway, that's what I want you to do. A whole lot of work there. You don't have to, it's optional in this class, but if you're serious about doing any kind of pen testing, you got to get good at that process. And there are many other ways to do it. I just found one path to victory and stuck with it. But once you have one, you can work on others. I tried to pick the ones that are most universal. Like, I think that eternal romance is the greatest thing in the world. You know that, you hardly need to know anything else. Before that, it was just MSO867. That's all you need to know for anything for years. And this seems like the next one there. Almost every machine is vulnerable right out of the box. It's bloody awesome. So, all right. So, what's the networking appropriate for home users? All right, work groups are what you have normally in small networks. All right, so what device stores the password hash for HackMe Sally? All right, good. The domain controller has the domain password hashes. That's why you have to get domain admin, and you have to exploit the domain controller to get them. All right, what object controls permissions for HackMe Sally? All right, that's group policy objects, as we saw. That's why you buy domain controllers, so you can specify whatever complicated mess of permissions is appropriate for your company. All right, so what module performs pivoting? All right, that's auto route. That creates a routing table entry to route certain traffic through the other box. There are probably other ways to do it, but that's one way. All right, what module impersonates tokens? All right, and that's Incognito. Good. All right. Let's get the top three. Serial killer times 2, day times 2, and KC. All right. Are there any questions about anything? I guess I won't demonstrate any of that. You can do it. But, all right. And I'm just going to stop this share, and I'll try and figure out who these people are. So I need to know who KC is, serial killer.